Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves the structure of one of the basic cells in the nervous system, the neuron. And in fact, this is kind of the biggie because it's the neurons that send the information through the nervous system. If glia are the supporting staff, these guys, are the starting lineup. They do all the work of sending the information. Now, I'm going to be showing you a diagram of a neuron, and it's a generic diagram. As I like to say, neurons all have these parts except for the ones that don't. It does give you an idea of the connections and the various parts. I am going to add a couple of parts in that aren't necessarily in the diagram, but it'll give you a good overview of the structure. And here we are. This might be a little small on YouTube. You could try expanding it if necessary. But if you have a diagram in your textbook, you can also follow along with that, because they all should have some variation of this, and they certainly should all have pretty much the same parts. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the path of a signal through the neuron, starting at where the signal is received and ending where it is sent onward to another destination. Now, signals are collected by neurons in root or twig-like structures that are called dendrites. In this diagram, they're in the lower left. Now, dendrite, they look kind of like a root or kind of like a twig. And the same way that roots collect nutrients and stuff from the soil, dendrites collect information from other cells. Now, they can either collect information from other neurons, or they can collect information from sense organs. From the vision receptors in your eye, the auditory receptors in your ear, the touch receptors in your skin, the chemical receptors in your nose and in your mouth. So they collect information, and the dendrites, of which, by the way, there can be hundreds, if not thousands, on a single neuron. Imagine the connections. Those dendrites collect information and they send it into the central area of the neuron, which is called the soma, S-O-M-A, soma. Now, inside the central area of the soma are all the workings of the cell. Since this isn't a biology class, I'm not going to go into huge detail. You don't need to know about the Golgi complexes and the endoplasmic reticula and the various organelles and that sort of thing. Mitochondria, you don't need to know about those, okay? Because this isn't a biology class. I am going to point out, and if you could see the arrow, there's a little sort of kidney bean shaped darker area here. That is part of the soma that I would like you to know about. It's called the nucleus. N-U-C-L-E-U-S. Now, the nucleus of the cell is where all the genetic information in that cell is stored. With two general exceptions, every cell in your body has a complete set of your genetic information. Those two exceptions, by the way, are red blood cells that don't have any genetic information, and sperm and egg cells that each only have half the usual complement of chromosomes. But all the genetic information is there inside the nucleus, and there'll be a lot more about that when we start talking about genetics and stuff in the developmental chapter. So the information is sent into the soma where there is all that workings of the cell, which really don't concern us here. And eventually, the information is then sent from the soma outwards, not through a dendrite. This is pretty much a one-way system here, y'all. Okay, it's things don't go back and forth. The information is sent from the soma through that larger structure that looks at the moment like it's covered with hot dog buns. This is called an axon. I'm going to put my pointer back here. This is called an axon right here. A-X-O-N, axon. Now, the axon sends information away from the soma and towards its destination, whatever that might be. A neuron can only have one axon. You can't have more than one. Now, you can have an axon that splits, but you can only have one axon. You can have hundreds of dendrites, one axon. Although there are neurons that don't have any axons. Axons are used to send information long distances. And in places like the brain, where neurons are packed in cheek by jowl like commuters on a subway train during rush hour, there's no real need to have long-distance communication. It's sort of like if you're standing right next to someone and you want to get their attention, you're probably going to tap them on the shoulder and not, for instance, call them on your phone. Then again, I might be wrong. I am an older, old-fashioned person. And I've never understood people sitting together and texting to one another in lieu of actual conversation. But, think of it that way. If you don't have to yell or whatever, you could just touch them and get their attention. But on the other hand, if someone is all the way across the room, you're going to have to do something a little bit more vigorous. So axons are present in neurons where information has to travel long distances. And by long distances, we can mean really long. There is an axon, there are a number of axons that run all the way from the tip of your toe all the way up to the base of your spinal cord. That's a long distance. So, yeah, we're talking long distance here. Now, to help that long distance happen, the axon is insulated. It's insulated with a fatty coating called myelin. Now, where does myelin come from? For the most part, it comes from glia. So myelin is an insulating material here. It basically helps keep that signal moving in the correct direction, and it also then helps keep the signal get all the way to where it's going. That's the thing here that looks kind of like a hot dog bun. Okay. The thing is, though, unlike the insulation on an electrical cord, myelin has gaps. See the gaps here? It doesn't run in a complete, uninterrupted covering over the entire axon. There's gaps. And these gaps are called nodes. N-O-D-E. Technically, they're called nodes of Ranvier. R-A-N-V-I-E-R. Or as we like to say in the Midwest, Ranvier. Okay? But they're nodes, and you'll learn more about the nodes when you learn about how this information is actually sent down the axon a little bit later. So the axon then heads toward where it's going. As it starts to get close to where it's going, you can see it begins to branch out. Now, these branching arms are called axon terminals. Now, terminal in this area is like, it's used kind of like a bus terminal or a railway terminal. It's where voyages begin and end. Or in the case of a terminal disease, where they end. And so these axon terminals then eventually wind up expanding into a little bubble-type job here at the end of the axon terminal. And these are called synaptic knobs. Synaptic knobs. Now, I learned to call them terminal buttons, but now the term is synaptic knobs. And it's from these synaptic knobs that the signal is sent from this neuron onward to wherever it's going. It may be sent on to another neuron, in which case, which part of the neuron is it going to be collected by? The dendrites! And then this whole process starts all over again. Or the synaptic knob can also send a signal on to a muscle. Your muscles are, of course, controlled by your nervous system. And a certain signal tells your muscles to contract, and another signal tells them to stop contracting. There is no signal for relax. Okay? All you can do is contract and not contract. It's why you can wind up with very tense muscles that seriously do not want to relax. You get knots or whatever. Now, it's very difficult to have a muscle that doesn't want to contract unless you're having some sort of neurological problem or have taken some sort of drugs to prevent that. But it's unfortunately very easy to get muscles that don't want to relax. And that's because the signal is an on-off switch. You contract it, or you send the signal to contract, you send the signal to the signal stops, you don't contract anymore. Okay? At any rate, synaptic knobs send the signal onward where it goes on to either another neuron or it goes on to a muscle. As a quick review, signals come into dendrites. They come into dendrites either from another neuron. What part of another neuron? Synaptic knobs. So they either come in from another neuron or they come from a sense organ. The signal is then sent to the soma of the cell, where all of the workings of the cell are located. Eventually, that signal is sent down the axon, one-way trip. The axon itself is insulated with myelin, with nodes of Ranvier along the way to help the signal along. You'll learn more about that later. Eventually, the axon will branch into axon terminals, and then at the end of those, you have the synaptic knobs, where the signal is sent onward either to another neuron or to a muscle. By the way, for those of you who stayed after that pause, over here on the right you actually see a photomicrograph of a very, very simple collection of a couple of neurons. Here you see the cell bodies, those big blobs are the cell bodies here. And here you see axons and perhaps some dendrites. I mean, look at that. That's a very simple connection. And this is one of the reasons why it may be impossible, even when we learn how to regrow brain cells, to eventually regrow all the connections that these cells make. Because how are you going to regrow all of those? It'd be almost impossible to follow each path that precisely when you're talking about thousands of dendrites perhaps per neuron and trillions of neurons in a brain. My motto is keep your brain as safe as you can. Then you won't have to worry about it, hopefully.